First World War had ended not with peace, but with humiliation. Germany, once proud and powerful, was left crippled by the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. Its army was reduced to a fraction of its former strength, its economy shattered, its pride stripped away. The treaty demanded reparations so enormous that even future generations would struggle to pay. Factories stood silent, the currency lost value faster than it could be printed, and hunger spread across cities once filled with industry and ambition. In this chaos, bitterness took root. Millions of German veterans returned home broken, both in body and spirit. They had survived the trenches only to face starvation and political collapse. In beer halls and crowded streets, they whispered of betrayal, the Dolchstoßlegende, the stab-in-the-back myth. They believed Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield but betrayed by politicians and civilians at home. This myth would become the foundation upon which a new, dangerous ideology would grow. Amid this national despair rose a man who spoke directly to the wounded pride of the German people, Adolf Hitler. A failed artist, a war veteran, and a powerful orator, he promised revival. In 1920, he joined the German Workers' Party, soon transforming it into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. His words were filled with rage, vengeance, and visions of a reborn Germany. He promised to restore strength, unity, and honor. By the early 1930s, the Great Depression hit the world. In Germany, it hit hardest. Unemployment soared beyond 6 million, hunger deepened, and democracy seemed powerless. People no longer wanted speeches about freedom, they wanted order, jobs, and dignity. Hitler offered all three. In 1933, he was appointed chancellor. Within months, he dismantled the last remnants of democracy. The Reichstag burned. Opposition was silenced. Fear replaced debate. Germany became a one-party state under his iron grip. But Hitler's vision went far beyond politics. He sought revenge for Versailles and the creation of a new order in Europe. His generals began rebuilding the army in secret. Aircraft factories, disguised as civilian plants, produced warplanes. New tanks were designed under the cover of agricultural machinery projects. The military, once forbidden to exceed 100,000 men, quietly expanded into hundreds of thousands. The world watched and hesitated. In 1936, Hitler made his first bold move. German troops marched into the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone under the treaty's terms. French and British leaders protested but did not act. The German soldiers carried orders to retreat at the first sign of Allied resistance, but none came. Hitler later admitted that it was the most nerve-wracking moment of his life. Had France intervened, his gamble would have failed. But Europe stayed silent. The first test of will was won. 2 years later, he struck again. Austria was annexed in March 1938 in what was called the Anschluss. German troops entered Vienna not as invaders but as heroes, greeted by cheering crowds. The world once again did nothing. The League of Nations, meant to keep peace, proved toothless. Hitler's confidence grew. In September 1938, his eyes turned to Czechoslovakia, specifically the Sudetenland, home to millions of ethnic Germans. Hitler demanded it. Britain and France, desperate to avoid another war, chose appeasement. At Munich, they handed over the territory without a single shot fired. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned home declaring, "Peace for our time." But peace had already died in Munich. For Hitler, these victories were not ends but rehearsals. Each success tested Europe's resolve and found it weak. Each conquest strengthened Germany's military and morale. The Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, was still an unspoken concept, but its foundations were forming. Fast strikes, coordination, and total psychological domination. By 1939, Germany stood transformed. The economy had been restructured for war. The Luftwaffe had thousands of aircraft ready. Panzer divisions trained relentlessly in new forms of mobile warfare. Propaganda filled every newspaper, every classroom, every radio broadcast. The German people were told they were destined to reclaim their place in history. In late August 1939, Hitler made his final preparation before unleashing war on Europe. He signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Soviet Union, a shocking alliance between two ideological enemies. The secret protocol divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, giving Hitler the freedom to strike west without fear of Soviet resistance. On the first day of September 1939, the world awoke to the sound of engines and explosions. German forces crossed into Poland under the banner of vengeance and destiny. Within hours, the Blitzkrieg had begun, and with it, the Second World War. Everything that followed, the conquest of France, the fall of Europe, the global conflict, began with these seeds: humiliation, anger, deception, and ambition. The war was not born overnight. It was forged over 20 years of silence, weakness, and willful blindness. The storm that would engulf the world had been gathering since the day the guns fell silent in 1918, and now it had finally returned. When the world first heard the word Blitzkrieg, lightning war, it sounded like something new, almost mythical. But in reality, it was not a weapon or a secret device. It was a mindset, a radical new way of fighting that shattered the slow, grinding warfare of the First World War. It combined speed, coordination, and terror into one devastating system designed to overwhelm an enemy before they could react. The lessons of World War I had been burned deep into the German military mind. The endless trenches, the useless human waves, and the static fronts had shown one truth: victory would not come from endurance, but from movement. A new generation of German officers, including Heinz Guderian, began studying how to make war move again. They believed that mobility, communication, and surprise would break the deadlock that had destroyed millions in the last war. In secret, they began experimenting. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, while the Treaty of Versailles restricted German armament, their military thinkers studied new theories under the disguise of defensive research. Guderian and others read foreign works, especially British and French experiments in mechanized warfare, and adapted them. But while other nations treated these ideas as experiments, Germany turned them into doctrine. The heart of Blitzkrieg was coordination, air, armor, and infantry working as one. Tanks were no longer to be used as slow-moving support for soldiers. They would lead the attack. The Luftwaffe, Germany's new air force, would strike first, destroying enemy communications, cutting off reinforcements, and throwing defenders into chaos. Behind the bombers, panzer divisions would surge forward, punching holes in the enemy line and racing deep into the rear, where they would destroy supply lines and command posts. Infantry would follow to secure territory, but the real victory would come from panic. Confusion so rapid that the enemy would collapse before they could reorganize. This doctrine required more than courage, it demanded precision and trust. Every officer had to know the larger objective, because fast movement meant isolated units would often be cut off. Communication became vital. German troops used radio in every tank, something the Allies considered unnecessary. This gave German commanders real-time control, a deadly advantage. The first test of this new strategy came in Poland, September 1939. German aircraft pounded Polish airfields and railways before dawn. Within hours, tanks and motorized units crossed the border, advancing faster than any army in history. The Polish army, brave but outdated, was trapped in pockets, unable to mount a coordinated defense. Within 3 weeks, Warsaw was surrounded. Within a month, Poland was gone. The world watched in disbelief. Many thought it was luck, It wasn't. It was blitzkrieg in motion. But Hitler and his generals knew Poland was only the beginning. They had to prove that the same method could work against stronger, more prepared enemies. The next challenge was France, a nation believed to have the most powerful army in Europe, protected by the Maginot Line, a chain of fortresses stretching across its eastern border. To most observers, Germany had no chance. The German High Command, however, saw opportunity in France's predictability. The French expected an attack through Belgium, just as in World War I. Hitler approved a daring plan, Fall-Gelb, Case Yellow. Instead of repeating the old routes, Germany would send its main panzer force through the Ardennes forest, a rugged, heavily wooded region that the French considered impassable for tanks. It was a calculated risk that only the blitzkrieg mindset could justify. On May 10, 1940, the plan unfolded. Luftwaffe aircraft bombed Belgian and Dutch defenses as paratroopers seized bridges and airfields. The main panzer divisions, led by Guderian and Rommel, pushed through the Ardennes at incredible speed. Within days, they reached the Meuse River. French commanders hesitated, believing it impossible for tanks to advance so fast. By the time they reacted, German engineers had already built bridges and crossed. The breakthrough came at Sedan. German Stuka dive bombers screamed down from the sky, their sirens shrieking like demons. They didn't just destroy, they terrified. French morale broke under the relentless assault. Once the tanks broke through, they never stopped. They raced westward, cutting off Allied forces that had moved into Belgium. Within a week, the German spearhead reached the English Channel, trapping hundreds of thousands of British and French troops. The world witnessed war evolving in real time. In less than 6 weeks, France, a major power with centuries of military prestige, collapsed. The Maginot Line was bypassed, Paris fell, and the armistice was signed in the same railway carriage where Germany had surrendered in 1918. The symbolism was deliberate. The empire that had once dictated peace terms to Germany now knelt before it. Blitzkrieg had proven unstoppable, but it was not magic. It worked because of preparation, planning, and psychological manipulation. It demanded absolute control from commanders, total discipline from soldiers, and perfect timing between air and ground forces. Yet beneath the triumph, cracks were already visible. Germany's industry was not built for a long war. Its fuel reserves were limited. Many officers warned that the rapid victories might lead to dangerous overconfidence. Still, in the summer of 1940, none of that mattered. Hitler's armies stood victorious across Europe. From Norway to the Pyrenees, the swastika flew over conquered capitals. The strategy of lightning war had reshaped the continent and terrified the world. The Blitzkrieg was not just a tactic. It was a revolution in warfare, a brutal fusion of technology, speed, and willpower. It replaced the slow bleed of the trenches with the shock of thunder. But like all storms, its power would depend on the ground it struck. And soon, Germany would discover that not every battlefield could be conquered by lightning. At dawn on September 1, 1939, the world changed forever. Without a formal declaration, Germany unleashed its full military might against Poland. The attack began at 4:45 a.m., when the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on the Polish garrison at Westerplatte near Danzig. Within minutes, the skies filled with the roar of engines as waves of German bombers crossed the border. The Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, had begun. For Poland, it was the beginning of a nightmare. The German army, the Wehrmacht, fielded more than 1 million men, 2,000 tanks, and nearly 2,000 aircraft. The Polish forces, brave but outdated, relied heavily on cavalry units and old artillery. Their air force was small, their tanks light, and their defensive lines stretched too thin to stop the storm. The German plan, known as Fall-Weiss, Case White, aimed for complete destruction through speed and encirclement. Two massive army groups attacked from the west and the south, while a smaller one advanced from East Prussia in the north. Their goal was to trap the Polish armies before they could retreat or reorganize. The Luftwaffe struck first, destroying airfields, rail lines, and communication centers. Within 2 days, most of the Polish Air Force was grounded or destroyed on the ground. German pilots ruled the sky unchallenged. The effect was chaos. Polish columns moving toward the front were strafed and bombed repeatedly. Refugees fleeing the front lines clogged the roads, making movement impossible for reinforcements. Entire cities, from Krakow to Lodz, were hit by relentless air raids. Warsaw, the proud capital, came under attack within the first week. German bombs turned apartment blocks, schools, and hospitals into rubble. On the ground, the German panzers moved faster than anything the world had seen before. In the opening days, General Heinz Guderian's 19 Corps advanced nearly 100 kilometers in just 2 days. His tanks cut through Polish defenses like a knife, bypassing strong points instead of wasting time in frontal assaults. Behind them came motorized infantry, cleaning up pockets of resistance and securing roads. At Piotrkow, near Lodz, the first major tank battles took place. Polish 7TP tanks, outnumbered and outgunned, fought fiercely but were overwhelmed by sheer numbers and coordination. The German radio communications gave them instant battlefield control, allowing them to strike from multiple directions while Polish units relied on couriers and telegraphs. Every hour lost meant another breakthrough. By September 7th, the Polish High Command ordered a general retreat toward the southeast, toward the so-called Romanian bridgehead, an area from which they hoped to regroup and receive supplies from Britain and France. But those supplies would never come. Despite their guarantees, the Western Allies moved slowly. France launched a token advance into Western Germany, then stopped. Britain bombed a few German ports but avoided any major confrontation. Poland was left to fight alone. As the German spearheads closed in, entire Polish armies were encircled. The Battle of Bzura, fought from September 9th to 19th, was Poland's largest counterattack. General Tadeusz Kościuszko led 150,000 men in a surprise assault that briefly pushed the Germans back. For a moment, it seemed the tide could turn, but the Luftwaffe crushed the offensive from the air. Thousands of Polish soldiers were trapped in open fields with no cover, bombed mercilessly until the counterattack collapsed. Meanwhile, Warsaw stood defiant. Civilians built barricades, soldiers fought street by street, and anti-aircraft guns fired until they melted. German propaganda predicted the city would fall within days. It held for nearly a month. The defenders refused to surrender even as food and ammunition ran out. The city became a symbol of resistance, but the outcome was inevitable. Then came the final blow. On September 17, 1939, while Polish forces were still fighting in the west, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. Stalin, following the secret terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, sent over 600,000 troops into eastern Poland. The country, already collapsing under German pressure, now faced invasion from two sides. There was no hope of survival. The Polish government fled to Romania, and by the end of September, organized resistance had collapsed. Warsaw surrendered on the 27th after enduring weeks of bombardment. On October 6th, the last pockets of the Polish army surrendered near Koch. In just over 5 weeks, a nation of 35 million people had been conquered. The cost was horrific. Poland lost over 70,000 soldiers killed, 130,000 wounded, and more than 700,000 taken prisoner. Civilian casualties exceeded 100,000 in the first month alone. German losses were minimal, around 16,000 dead and 30,000 wounded. The imbalance was staggering, proof of the effectiveness of Blitzkrieg. After the campaign, Germany and the Soviet Union divided Poland between them. The border was drawn along the Bug River, as secretly agreed weeks earlier in Moscow. Hitler staged victory parades in Berlin. Stalin held his own in Minsk. Between them, Poland ceased to exist as a free state. But beneath the triumph, darker realities were already forming. The German occupation brought terror, mass executions, deportations, and the first steps of racial cleansing. In the forests near Palmyra and Bydgoszcz, Polish intellectuals and officers were shot. Thousands of Jews were forced into ghettos. The full machinery of Nazi oppression had begun its work. The fall of Poland shocked the world, not just because it happened, but because of how fast it happened. The old style of warfare, slow mobilization, defensive trenches, long battles, was gone. In its place stood a new, terrifying model of modern war. Speed, coordination, and fear had proven deadlier than numbers or fortifications. For Hitler, Poland was a test, and it had worked perfectly. France and Britain had declared war but done nothing effective. The world had condemned him with words, not action. The message was clear: the West would talk, but not fight. And that gave Hitler the confidence to move west. As German troops returned home, their tanks covered in dust and their ranks celebrated as heroes, the next stage of Blitzkrieg was already being planned. The generals began drawing lines across maps of Belgium and France. The lightning had struck once. Soon it would strike again, this time at the heart of Western Europe. After the fall of Poland in early October 1939, Europe stood on the edge of silence. Britain and France had declared war on Germany on September 3rd, fulfilling their guarantees to Poland, yet neither nation made a serious move. For 7 long months, from the autumn of 1939 to the spring of 1940, the guns on the Western Front barely fired. This strange pause became known as the Phony War, a war without battles, where armies faced each other across fortified borders, waiting for the storm they knew was coming. To many ordinary Europeans, it seemed almost unreal. Newspapers printed daily updates about the state of war. But life in cities like Paris and London went on almost as normal. Soldiers were mobilized, trenches were dug, but no major offensive took place. People began calling it the Sitzkrieg, the sitting war. Others joked about it as the Boer War. But behind the calm, something far more serious was taking shape. On the German side, Hitler was not idle. While the world believed he might stop after Poland, he was already planning the next stage. His generals gathered intelligence on the French defenses and British troop movements. Germany's industry worked day and night to produce tanks, aircraft, and ammunition. The Wehrmacht was reorganized, rested, and supplied. The pause that the Allies mistook for peace was, for Germany, a time of preparation. Across the border, in France, millions of soldiers stood along the Maginot Line, a chain of concrete fortresses, bunkers, and underground tunnels stretching from Switzerland to Luxembourg. It was considered one of the strongest defensive systems ever built. French commanders believed that as long as the line held, Germany could not invade. They were confident, perhaps too confident. But the Maginot Line had one fatal flaw. It did not extend along the entire French border. To the north, beyond the Ardennes forest, lay Belgium, neutral territory. French planners assumed the dense Ardennes was impenetrable to tanks, a natural barrier no army would dare cross. They were wrong. During the Phony War, French and British forces advanced slightly into Germany's Saar region in September 1939, hoping to relieve pressure on Poland. The operation, poorly coordinated and hesitant, advanced only a few kilometers before stopping. When Poland fell, the Allied troops quietly withdrew back behind the Maginot Line. It was a symbolic gesture, not a serious attempt at war. The soldiers settled into routine. Long patrols, endless waiting, and freezing nights. Meanwhile, on the seas and in the skies, the war had already begun to stir. The German U-boat campaign targeted Allied shipping in the Atlantic. In September 1939, the British passenger liner Athenia was torpedoed and sunk, killing more than 100 civilians. In November, the Royal Navy scored its first major victory when British destroyers trapped and sank the German pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee off the coast of South America. These naval duels hinted at the global scale the war would soon reach. In the air, the first bombing raids began not on cities but on naval bases and industrial sites. The British Royal Air Force carried out reconnaissance and propaganda leaflet drops over Germany. The leaflets urged the German people to resist Hitler, but few took notice. For now, both sides avoided heavy civilian bombing, remembering the horrors of World War I. But the restraint would not last. Through the winter of 1939 to 1940, soldiers on both sides endured bitter cold and monotony. In muddy trenches and drafty barracks, men passed the time with cards, songs, and letters from home. British troops stationed in France, part of the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, joked that they were on an extended holiday. The French called them les touristes de la guerre, the tourists of war. Yet beneath the humor was unease. Everyone knew the calm could not last forever. In January 1940, a strange event broke the stillness. A German officer carrying secret invasion plans crashed his plane in Belgium near the town of Mechelen. The documents revealed Germany's original plan to attack through central Belgium, similar to their route in World War I. The Allies believed they now understood Hitler's strategy. In reality, the incident pushed the German High Command to change their plans entirely. Out of this accident came Fall Gelb, a daring new strategy that would send German panzers through the impassable Ardennes, a move no one expected. While Germany refined its invasion plan, another front quietly opened in the north. In November 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland, beginning the Winter War. The Finns fought with extraordinary courage against overwhelming numbers, earning admiration worldwide. Though Finland was eventually forced to make peace in March 1940, their resistance showed that smaller nations could still defy great powers. The Allies even considered sending troops to help Finland, but political indecision delayed everything until it was too late. By early spring, the illusion of calm was breaking. Germany began moving troops toward the western borders. On April 9, 1940, the waiting ended. Without warning, German forces invaded Denmark and Norway. Denmark fell in a single day. Norway resisted longer but was eventually conquered after weeks of fighting. The invasions shocked Europe. Suddenly, the phony war was over. The lightning war had returned, this time in the north. The fall of Norway revealed the truth. The months of stillness had been a deception. Hitler had used the time to perfect his strategy, gather resources, and prepare the most ambitious military campaign since Napoleon, the conquest of Western Europe. The Allies, lulled by false security, had wasted their chance to strike first. When the German armies turned their eyes toward France and the Low Countries in May 1940, the world would finally understand that the phony war had never been peace. It had been the calm before the storm, the deep breath before Europe plunged into fire. The soldiers who had waited through that long winter would soon find themselves facing the full fury of Blitzkrieg. The silence of the Western Front would be shattered by the roar of engines, the scream of dive bombers, and the thunder of tanks breaking through the Ardennes. The war that everyone had feared, and too many had doubted, was about to begin in earnest. May 10, 1940. At dawn, the stillness of the Ardennes forest was shattered by the rumble of German engines. The plan, codenamed Fall Gelb, or Case Yellow, was about to begin. To the Allied command, the dense, hilly forests of the Ardennes were considered impassable for armored divisions. It was precisely this belief that Hitler's generals intended to exploit. Under the command of General Heinz Guderian and General Erwin Rommel, columns of panzer tanks, trucks, and motorcycles began advancing through narrow forest roads. For 3 days, they moved under strict radio silence, headlights covered, engines muffled. From above, Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes patrolled the skies to ensure no Allied aircraft caught sight of the operation. By May 12th, the German columns had reached the Meuse River near the town of Sedan. The French believed their main line of defense, the Maginot Line, protected them from any major attack. They assumed the Ardennes acted as a natural barrier. But Guderian knew that speed and shock would replace brute force. Engineers quickly built pontoon bridges across the river under intense artillery fire. The Luftwaffe unleashed one of the most concentrated air assaults of the war, bombing French positions and destroying morale before the ground attack even began. The French defenses at Sedan collapsed within hours. Soldiers who had been told no attack could come through the forest suddenly found German tanks pouring across the river. Confusion spread rapidly along the French lines. Commanders were unable to respond quickly, communications were slow, and headquarters still believed the main German attack was happening further north, in Belgium. Once the bridgeheads were secured, Guderian's panzers surged forward like a steel tide. Behind them came motorized infantry and supply units, moving in perfect synchronization. It was the embodiment of blitzkrieg, fast, coordinated strikes that left the enemy disoriented before they could organize a defense. Rommel's 7th Panzer Division, nicknamed the Ghost Division, moved so rapidly that even the German high command temporarily lost track of its position. By May 15th, the Germans had advanced more than 60 miles in just 5 days. The French lines were broken wide open. Entire divisions were surrounded, cut off from reinforcements and supplies. The Ardennes, once thought to be the safest sector of the front, had become the entry point for the greatest disaster in modern French military history. As Guderian's tanks raced westward toward the English Channel, the Allies realized their mistake too late. The main German force had bypassed their strongest fortifications entirely. The British Expeditionary Force and much of the French army were being trapped in northern France, squeezed between German forces advancing from the Ardennes and others pushing south from Belgium. The breakthrough at the Ardennes marked the turning point of the Western campaign. It wasn't just a victory of machines or tactics. It was a triumph of deception and daring. German intelligence had read their enemy's mind, understood their assumptions, and then turned them into fatal weaknesses. By the end of May, the outcome of the French campaign was already decided. What had begun as a gamble had turned into one of the most stunning operational successes in military history. The myth of the impenetrable Ardennes had been shattered forever. This was the moment Europe realized that Germany's war was not to be fought in the trenches, but in the lightning speed of tanks, planes, and strategy. By early June 1940, France, the proud nation that had once held the world's strongest army, was on the verge of collapse. In just 4 weeks, the German war machine had torn through Belgium, bypassed the Maginot Line, and broken the French front in half. The strategy had been flawless. Feint in the north, strike through the center, and trap the Allied forces before they could react. As German tanks surged out of the Ardennes and across northern France, the French command struggled to understand what was happening. Reports came in too late, communications were in chaos, and orders were often outdated before they reached the front. General Charles de Gaulle attempted several counterattacks with his armored divisions, managing brief successes, but they could not stem the tide. The French army, built for a slow, defensive war, was being crushed by the speed and coordination of blitzkrieg. On May 20th, Guderian's tanks reached the English Channel near Abbeville, cutting off the British Expeditionary Force and a large part of the French army in northern France. It was a stunning blow. The Allies were encircled. What followed was the desperate evacuation at Dunkirk, Operation Dynamo, where over 330,000 British and French soldiers were rescued by a fleet of naval ships and civilian boats between May 26 and June 4. It was a miracle of survival, but also an admission of defeat. Those who escaped left behind their weapons, their tanks, and the shattered remnants of their divisions. With the British gone, France stood alone. The Germans now turned their full power southward. Paris, though declared an open city to prevent its destruction, was filled with refugees and fear. Millions fled the approaching front lines. Families, farmers, government officials, clogging the roads in one of the largest civilian evacuations in modern history. On June 5, the Germans launched Fall Rot, the second phase of their invasion. Wehrmacht divisions swept across the Somme and Aisne rivers. The French resistance crumbled. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies, bombing bridges, convoys, and communication lines. Every attempt to regroup was shattered by air raids and artillery fire. Town after town fell in rapid succession. By June 10th, the French government abandoned Paris and fled to Bordeaux. Italy, seeing an opportunity to join in the victory, declared war on France that same day, hoping to claim spoils without risk. The French army, exhausted and out of ammunition, tried to form defensive lines along the Loire, but morale had collapsed. Desertions increased, and entire units surrendered without firing a shot. On June 14th, German troops entered Paris. There was no resistance. The swastika was raised over the Eiffel Tower as Wehrmacht columns marched down the Champs-Élysées. The French capital, once the heart of European culture and power, fell in silence. 6 days later, on June 20th, Marshal Philippe Pétain, hero of World War I, announced that France must stop fighting. "The fighting must cease," he declared, to avoid further bloodshed. On June 22, 1940, the armistice was signed in the very same railway carriage where Germany had surrendered to France in 1918. Hitler insisted on it, a deliberate act of revenge meant to humiliate the French nation. The terms were harsh. Northern and Western France, including Paris, were placed under direct German occupation. The southern zone was left nominally independent under Pétain's collaborationist Vichy regime. The French fleet was disarmed, the army reduced, and millions of French soldiers were taken prisoner. In just 6 weeks, one of the world's great powers had been defeated. The Lightning War had lived up to its name. France's defenses, built for the last war, had fallen before a new kind of warfare, one defined by mobility, coordination, and psychological shock. But amid the ashes, a new voice emerged. From London, Charles de Gaulle broadcast his appeal to the French people on June 18th, urging them not to surrender in spirit. "France has lost a battle," he said, "but France has not lost the war." The fall of France reshaped Europe. Germany stood triumphant from the Baltic to the Pyrenees. Britain was now the last nation standing between Hitler and total domination of the continent. The Blitzkrieg had conquered the land, but the next phase would be fought in the skies above England. In the spring of 1940, before the fall of France, Hitler's attention had already turned north. Control of Scandinavia meant control of vital resources, iron or from Sweden, shipped through the Norwegian port of Narvik. Without it, Germany's war industry would stall. Britain, aware of this dependency, was also eyeing Norway, planning to cut off Germany's lifeline. The stage was set for a sudden, ruthless campaign, the Northern Blitz. The operation, codenamed Weserübung, began on April 9, 1940. At dawn, German warships appeared off the coasts of Denmark and Norway. Paratroopers and infantry units landed simultaneously in Copenhagen, Oslo, Bergen, Trondheim, and Narvik. It was the first large-scale joint sea, land, and air operation of the war, a test of the Blitzkrieg concept under entirely new conditions. Denmark was overwhelmed within 6 hours. Its small army, outnumbered and outgunned, had no chance of resistance. The Danish government surrendered almost immediately to avoid unnecessary destruction. For Hitler, Denmark was merely a stepping stone, a gateway to Norway. Norway, however, was a different story. Its terrain, mountains, fjords, and narrow coastal towns made any invasion difficult. The Norwegian army, though small, resisted bravely, aided by British and French expeditionary forces who landed soon after. Battles erupted in Narvik, Namsos, and Andelsnes as Allied troops clashed with German mountain divisions. At sea, the campaign was brutal. The Royal Navy sank several German destroyers and transports, inflicting heavy losses. But Germany's control of the skies shifted the balance. The Luftwaffe bombed Allied ships relentlessly, destroying cruisers and supply convoys. The aircraft carrier Glorious was sunk by the German battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. Oslo fell quickly after German paratroopers captured nearby airfields and cut off Norwegian defenses. King Haakon VII and his government refused to surrender, escaping north to continue resistance. By late April, most major Norwegian cities were under German occupation. Only in Narvik did the Allies gain a temporary victory, retaking the port after fierce fighting in snow-covered mountains. But the triumph was short-lived. As the situation in France deteriorated, the British government made a hard decision: to withdraw from Norway and redirect forces to defend the collapsing Western Front. On June 8, the last Allied troops left Narvik. German forces reoccupied the city soon after. Norway capitulated on June 10, 1940. The same day, Italy entered the war on Germany's side. The conquest of Denmark and Norway had taken just 2 months. For Hitler, it was both a strategic and psychological victory. Germany now controlled the entire northern coastline of Europe, from the Arctic Circle to the French border. Naval bases in Norway allowed U-boats and aircraft to strike deep into the Atlantic, threatening Britain's vital supply lines. The Northern Blitz was a showcase of coordination: airborne troops securing airfields, naval fleets delivering infantry directly to enemy ports, and rapid exploitation of shock and confusion. Yet the campaign had come at a price. Germany lost nearly half of its surface fleet, a blow that would limit its naval capabilities for the rest of the war. For the people of Norway and Denmark, occupation brought a harsh new reality. German troops enforced martial law, resistance groups formed in secret, and the once free northern kingdoms found themselves drawn into the machinery of Hitler's empire. From Berlin, the success of the Northern Blitz confirmed Hitler's growing belief in the invincibility of his forces. Europe's north was secured, France was falling, and Britain stood alone. But the northern conquest also carried a message, a warning of what the new era of warfare would bring. Lightning assaults that struck without declaration, overwhelming force delivered from land, sea, and sky, and the ruthless speed that left nations no time to react. The quiet fjords of Norway had become the testing ground for a new form of domination. The world was beginning to understand that nowhere, no matter how remote, was beyond the reach of the Blitzkrieg. By mid-1940, Germany stood triumphant across Europe. Poland had been crushed, Norway and Denmark subdued, France humiliated, and the Low Countries occupied. Only Britain defied Hitler's dominance. But before turning fully toward invasion, Hitler began to wage a different kind of war. One fought not with tanks or bombers, but with words, promises, and lies. This was the era of diplomacy and deception. Behind the front lines, the German Foreign Office under Joachim von Ribbentrop worked relentlessly to reshape Europe's political map. Hitler understood that raw military power alone could not sustain control. Alliances, fear, and manipulation would ensure that occupied territories stayed obedient, and that potential enemies remained divided. The Soviet Union was the first piece of this intricate puzzle. Though ideological opposites, Germany and the USSR were still bound by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed in August 1939. It had divided Eastern Europe between them, Poland split in two, the Baltics and Finland falling into Moscow's sphere. For the moment, Stalin and Hitler pretended to be partners. Trade continued, Soviet oil, grain, and raw materials flowed west, feeding the German war machine. In return, Germany sent manufactured goods and machinery. Yet beneath the surface, both sides were watching each other, preparing for the inevitable betrayal. Meanwhile, Hitler's diplomats sought to isolate Britain further. He ordered overtures toward neutral nations, Spain, Switzerland, Sweden, and Turkey, pressuring them to align economically or strategically with Germany. Spain's dictator, Francisco Franco, though sympathetic, refused to join the Axis without guarantees and supplies that Germany couldn't spare. Turkey, balancing between powers, stayed officially neutral but traded with both sides. In occupied Europe, Hitler cloaked his domination under the illusion of partnership. Puppet governments were established. The Vichy regime in southern France, Quisling's collaborationist rule in Norway, and fascist sympathizers installed in other regions. These regimes pretended to serve national interests but were tools of Berlin's control. Nazi propaganda portrayed them as allies in the fight against communism, masking the reality of occupation and exploitation. Diplomacy became a weapon. Through negotiations and promises, Germany sought to lure new partners into its orbit. In September 1940, the Tripartite Pact was signed, uniting Germany, Italy, and Japan. It declared mutual support against any power not already involved in the European or Asian conflicts, an unmistakable warning to the United States. This alliance extended the Axis influence across 3 continents, but it was built on fragile trust and self-interest. Deception was at the heart of German foreign policy. Hitler's speeches continued to emphasize peace, even as new offensives were planned in secret. He assured neutral nations that Germany had no territorial ambitions, days before invading their neighbors. To the world, he spoke of defending Europe from chaos. To his generals, he promised conquest. One of the most audacious acts of deception came with the build-up to Operation Barbarossa, the planned invasion of the Soviet Union. Throughout late 1940 and early 1941, Germany maintained the illusion of friendship with Moscow. Diplomatic envoys visited each other's capitals, trade continued, and public statements praised the strong relations between the two powers. Yet behind closed doors, German intelligence was mapping Soviet positions, studying railways, oil fields, and troop concentrations. In the Balkans, deception and diplomacy merged into open manipulation. Hitler sought control of the southeastern flank before moving east. He promised protection and prosperity to Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary in exchange for military cooperation. When Yugoslavia hesitated, Germany orchestrated a coup and invaded within days, crushing resistance in less than 2 weeks. Every move was calculated to maintain the illusion of order, even as chaos spread under the surface. While Hitler maneuvered on the world stage, Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine reinforced the narrative of German invincibility. Radio broadcasts, films, and newspapers portrayed Hitler as a master strategist, both warrior and diplomat, whose words could bend nations. In reality, his diplomacy relied on intimidation and betrayal, not persuasion. By late 1940, Europe's diplomatic map was redrawn in Germany's image. The continent was divided between collaborators, neutrals, and occupied states, all bound by fear of the Reich. But this network of control was fragile. Every promise Hitler made carried the seed of deception. Every treaty signed was destined to be broken. Diplomacy and deception had bought Germany time to prepare for the next stage of expansion. Behind the polite handshakes and staged photographs, a new invasion was already forming in Hitler's mind. the destruction of his temporary ally, the Soviet Union. As the world watched diplomatic gestures unfold, few understood that they were witnessing the calm before the greatest storm in human history. The same pen that signed treaties in Berlin would soon be replaced by fire and steel on the vast fields of the East. By 1940, Germany's power stretched across most of Europe, not only through armies and weapons, but through something less visible and far more insidious: control of the mind. While tanks and aircraft conquered the land, propaganda conquered the people. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda and Public Enlightenment, oversaw a vast machinery of influence designed to mold every thought, emotion, and belief within the German Reich and its occupied territories. Goebbels understood that fear was as effective a weapon as bullets. Every newspaper, radio station, film studio, and theater was brought under direct Nazi control. Independent journalism disappeared. The press became a mouthpiece of the state. Morning papers announced German victories before they happened. Defeats were hidden, rebranded as strategic withdrawals. Every headline carried a message of destiny, unity, and racial superiority. In homes across Germany, the Volksempfänger, the People's Radio, broadcast Hitler's speeches directly into living rooms. The low-cost radio, distributed widely by the government, ensured that no citizen was beyond the reach of Nazi messaging. The airwaves carried endless praise for the Führer, stories of heroic soldiers, and warnings of Britain's decadence and the Bolshevik threat. The constant repetition created a world where truth was no longer defined by facts, but by the voice of power. In schools, children were taught Nazi ideology from their earliest years. Textbooks were rewritten to glorify German history and distort science to fit racial doctrine. Teachers were forced to swear loyalty to Hitler, and those who refused were dismissed or worse. The Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls became mandatory instruments of indoctrination. They trained the young not only in discipline and obedience, but in devotion. To millions of German children, the Führer was not a politician, he was a savior. Art and culture were equally weaponized. Modernist and abstract art were labeled degenerate, banned from galleries and burned in public displays. Only works that glorified Aryan ideals, strong bodies, loyal families, heroic soldiers were permitted. Music, theater, and cinema became tools of emotional control. Leni Riefenstahl's films, especially Triumph of the Will, turned political rallies into mythic spectacles, blending choreography, music, and architecture to present Hitler as the living embodiment of destiny. Fear sustained obedience. The Gestapo, the secret state police, operated without restraint. They relied not only on spies, but on ordinary citizens. Neighbors, co-workers, even family members were encouraged to report un-German behavior. A careless word, a joke about Hitler, or the possession of a banned book could lead to arrest, torture, or disappearance. No one knew who could be trusted, and that uncertainty became a powerful weapon of control. In occupied Europe, propaganda worked alongside terror. German-controlled radio stations broadcast promises of order and stability under the Reich. Posters appeared in cities, depicting Hitler as a bringer of peace, even as executions and deportations filled the streets. Local collaborators were used to give the illusion of cooperation. Behind the scenes, the SS and Gestapo silenced dissent with arrests and mass killings. The combination of propaganda and fear created an atmosphere where resistance seemed impossible. Millions accepted the new reality, not because they believed in it, but because disbelief was too dangerous. Even those who doubted the regime's words learned to remain silent. Goebbels's ministry had achieved its purpose: to make lies indistinguishable from truth and obedience indistinguishable from survival. The Nazi regime's control of information reached beyond Germany's borders. Through films, leaflets, and diplomatic channels, It spread narratives aimed at dividing its enemies. Britain was portrayed as the enemy of peace, the Soviet Union as a temporary ally against Western greed, and later, the United States as a corrupt nation run by Jewish financiers. Every nation received a tailored story designed to fracture alliances and sow mistrust. But even within the regime, propaganda was a double-edged sword. It trapped the German people inside a world of illusion. By late 1940, many believed the war was already won. Hitler's victories seemed unstoppable, and Goebbels encouraged the belief that Germany's dominance was permanent. This illusion would later magnify the shock of defeat when the tide of war turned. In the short term, however, propaganda and terror achieved total control. Dissent was buried, conscience silenced. People learned to repeat slogans rather than think. The church, the press, the classroom all became extensions of the Reich. Goebbels once wrote in his diary, "We do not talk to say something, we talk to achieve something." His purpose was never to inform, but to reshape reality itself, to make people love their oppressors, to make them fear freedom more than chains. By the end of 1940, Germany had mastered not only the art of war, but the art of manipulation. The world saw its military conquests. Few understood that its greatest victory lay in the invisible battlefield of the human mind. By late 1940, Hitler's empire stretched from the Atlantic to the borders of the Soviet Union. In just over a year, Germany had done what the Kaiser's armies failed to do in 4. But the seeds of defeat were already buried beneath the victories. The same speed and arrogance that had fueled the Blitzkrieg were now pushing Germany toward overreach. Too many enemies, too much territory, and too little time. Hitler believed his momentum was unstoppable. France had fallen, Britain stood isolated, and the Soviet Union appeared unprepared. In his mind, history had chosen him to reshape Europe entirely. But beneath the illusion of control, cracks were forming. The German economy, strained by endless mobilization, struggled to supply both civilian needs and the expanding war machine. Raw materials, especially oil and rubber, were scarce. The Luftwaffe and Navy, both weakened by the campaigns in Norway and France, were far from ready for a prolonged global war. The first major sign of overreach came with the Battle of Britain. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of the British Isles, depended entirely on achieving air superiority. In the summer of 1940, the Luftwaffe launched massive bombing campaigns over southern England, striking airfields, radar stations, and industrial centers. But the British Royal Air Force, aided by radar and fighting on home soil, held firm. The German losses mounted. By October, Hitler quietly postponed the invasion. The Blitz continued, bombs falling nightly over London and other cities, but it was no longer a strategy for conquest, only one of terror. The first defeat of Nazi expansion had occurred not on land but in the air. Britain's survival meant Germany's war was no longer one of quick victories. It would become a long struggle of endurance, and time was not on Hitler's side. As winter approached, Hitler's attention turned eastward. His obsession with destroying Bolshevism and seizing the Soviet Union's vast resources grew stronger. Advisors warned against it. Even his generals cautioned that fighting on two fronts had doomed Germany once before. But Hitler dismissed them all. In December 1940, he signed Directive No. 21, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. While German planners prepared for the colossal Eastern Campaign, other regions began to spiral out of control. In North Africa, Mussolini's armies stumbled in their invasion of Egypt, forcing Hitler to divert troops to rescue his ally. In the Balkans, Yugoslavia and Greece resisted Axis pressure, prompting another campaign that delayed the attack on the USSR by several critical weeks. Each new, quick operation added another burden to an already overstretched army. Inside occupied Europe, resistance movements were growing. In Poland, France, Norway, and the Netherlands' underground networks began to sabotage railways, gather intelligence, and assist escaped Allied soldiers. The Gestapo responded with brutal reprisals. Executions, deportations, entire villages destroyed, but the flame of defiance had been lit. Controlling territory was one thing. Controlling the human spirit was another. The illusion of total dominance began to erode. Germany's victories had been too fast, too vast. Every conquered nation required occupation forces, resources, and administration. Supply lines stretched for thousands of miles. Factories in the Reich operated day and night, but production could not keep up with the demands of the front. Even the Wehrmacht, victorious and confident, felt the weight of exhaustion and shortages. Yet Hitler pressed forward. He saw hesitation as weakness, doubt as treason. His leadership style became increasingly erratic, based on instinct, ideology, and rage rather than strategy. The generals who questioned him were sidelined or dismissed. Decisions that once rested on military logic were now shaped by his personal vision of destiny. Diplomatically, Germany's position was weakening as well. The Tripartite Pact had expanded to include Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, but these alliances were based on fear, not loyalty. In the West, Britain stood defiant under Churchill's leadership, now strengthened by growing American support. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's Lend-Lease program began supplying Britain with weapons, food, and ships, signaling that the United States was no longer neutral in practice. The year 1941 would become the true test. Hitler's belief in the invincibility of Blitzkrieg, the idea that every war could be won in weeks, would collide with the vastness of Russia, the endurance of Britain, and the industrial power of America. Germany was at the height of its power, yet also at the brink of its limits. In Berlin, Goebbels continued to proclaim eternal victory. Propaganda celebrated each new campaign as proof of destiny fulfilled. But beneath the parades and speeches, the truth was beginning to show. German soldiers on leave spoke of endless fighting and fatigue. Civilians whispered about food shortages and missing relatives. The fear that once unified the Reich was now mixed with unease, a quiet sense that the war was growing too large to control. The turning point had begun, not with a single battle but with a shift in momentum. Hitler's empire had reached its zenith. From this height, every new step forward would carry the seeds of disaster. Overreach was no longer a possibility, it was already underway. And as the world watched, the man who had conquered Europe prepared to make the same fatal mistake that had doomed every empire before his, believing that power had no limits.